Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and in today's lessons, we're going to be painting a biological portrait of Samson, who is generally considered to be the most significant figure in Israel's history during her period of judges, which is documented in the Book of Judges. This is the pre-monarchical period during which time Israel struggled to maintain its territorial integrity and was frequently overrun by foreigners in the adjacent territory on account of their apostasy, and Samson was one such judge whom Yahweh had risen to deliver them. And there's actually a lot to cover. His story spans the range of the 13th through 16th chapter. For the sake of time, we're not going to read every verse in between then, but we're going to pinpoint select passages and give you some summaries of the material in between as we develop. And rather than give you the context in advance, we're going to allow the context to reveal itself with the reading of that. So that being said, we're going to open with the first verse of the 13th chapter, which reads, "And again the children of Israel did evil in the eyes of Yahweh. So Yahweh gave them into the hand of the Philistines for 40 years. For the sixth and final times we read that Israel did evil in the eyes of Yahweh. Yahweh was watching them and had given them a covenant, which the terms of which can be summarized in their most general terms as blessings and prosperity for obedience, and curses and consequences and warnings for apostasy. So Israel constantly struggled throughout this period of her history with apostasy, and because they did, they found themselves at the mercy of foreign forces in the adjacent region. And this particular foreign entity, the Philistines, they were Aegean pirates of Greek origin, and the duration at which they dominated Israel was 40 years. This is the longest period of foreign domination of which we read of in the Book of Judges. And there was a certain man from Zozar, of the clan of the Danites, whose name was Manoah, and his wife was barren, and had not borne. So from the tribe of Dan was from whose ranks Samson sprung. They were, I believe, located at the northernmost extremity of the Promised Land, and his father's name was Manoah. And several times in Scripture we read that a barren or infertile wife is blessed with child who's going to do great things. We read of this with Sarah and Isaac and Elizabeth and John the Baptist, who, like Samson, was a Nazarite from birth. We're going to touch on that. And an angel of Yahweh appeared to the woman and said to her, "See now, you are barren, and you have not born, but you shall conceive, and you shall bear a son." So this must be music to her ears, because the pride and joy of Jewish womanhood was motherhood, and this was a privilege she had been denied, and it was past the time of childbearing. But the angel gives her the assurance that she will, in fact, her treasured child will be born through her. So it's never too late, and nothing is impossible with Yahweh. "And now please keep, and do not drink or drink wine or strong drink, and do not eat anything unclean." These are the standards to be observed and obeyed by the mother, which are passed on to the son. "For look, you are conceiving and bearing a son, and let no razor come upon his head, for the youth is a Nazarite to Elohim from the womb on, and he shall begin to save Israel out of the hands of the Philistines." So the Nazarite was usually a temporary vow, the outlines of their restrictions, what they could and couldn't do, and what they were supposed to do. They were supposed to be consecrated especially to Yahweh for a period of time. Now, the Nazarite from life, we read that Samson was to observe these standards and strictures his entire life. So his hair was not to be cut, and that ultimately contributes to the loss of his tremendous strength. And he wasn't supposed to touch a dead carcass. We read that he scooped out honey of the lion that he killed. So even though the Nazarite vow, the keeping of it, was the secret of his strength, he did not always honor and protect the source from which that great strength came. And through that great strength, he was the physically strongest creature in human history, and he was the one who was going to deliver them from their Philistine oppressors. Now we're going to skip to the 12th through 14th verse. There's just some dialogue between the man and the woman and the angel. And then we read, "And Manoah said, 'Now let your words come true. What is to be the rule for the youth's life and his work?'" So we gather that Manoah was not visited by the angel until now, and so he's asking him what special standards and restrictions are to be imposed on this child. and what is his work is to deliver the Philistines. Now, how is he going to do that? And the angel answers, and the angel of Yahweh said to Manoah, let the woman keep all that I said to her. Let her not eat anything that comes from the vine, neither let her drink wine or strong drink, or anything unclean. Let her keep all that which I have commanded her. So at this moment in time, his concerns with the mother to pass on the restrictions which her son is to shun if he's in order to be strong and successful, and to do the thing he was appointed to do. He was anointed to be their deliverer from the Philistines, who had devastated and degraded them, and they totally deserved it because they were completely and fully apostate at this time. Now the final two verses, the 24th and the 25th of the 13th chapter, read, so the woman bore a son and called his name Samson, and the child grew, and Yahweh blessed him. So even though he wasn't immediately strong, he would develop strength with the passage of time. He matured just like anyone else. He wasn't Hercules as a baby, but he was blessed by Yahweh from his childhood on. And then we read, and the Ruah of Yahweh began to move him at Manadan, between Zor and Eshetal. Now the Spirit of Yahweh, the Old Covenant people would have thought of the Spirit of Yahweh as an extension of Yahweh, hence it's attributed as belonging to Yahweh in this passage. The emergence of the distinct divine entity would not be solidified until the New Testament passage, but the Ruach Kadesh was given for specially selected people, for specially selected persons, and the Spirit, not his hair or anything else, was the source of his tremendous strength. And Samson went down to Timnah and saw a woman in Timnah of the daughters of the Philistines. So this would have been forbidden fruit. One, the Israelites were not to have interracial or intermixed marriages. They were to breed exclusively amongst themselves, because the religious practices of the foreign husbands or wife could creep in and compromise the attention and affection that the child owed Yahweh. And the Philistines was their oppressors. These were the last people he should have been courting at this moment in time. And he went up and informed his father and mother, saying, I have seen a woman in Timnah of the daughters of the Philistine, and now take her for me for a wife. So he was completely captured and infatuated with this woman, so much so that he asks his parental blessings to sanctify the marriage, but the parents know better, and so we read, but his father and mother said to him, is there no woman among the daughters of your brothers or among all my people that you should take a wife from the uncircumcised Philistine? And Samson said to his father, take her for me, for she is pleasing in my eyes. So Samson was walking by sight. He was enticed by the physical beauty of this woman, so much so that he neglected to walk by faith and honor the law against intercultural marriages. And so his word, his parents' reasonable petition is not processed by him. He is so governed by his eyes and the lust of his heart that he doesn't want to hear it. He doesn't want to listen to them. And then we read in the 5th and 6th verse, then Samson went down to Timnah with his father and mother, and came to the vineyard of Timnah, and see, a young lion came roaring at him. And the Spirit of Yahweh came mightily upon him, and he tore it apart as the tearing apart of a young goat, with knot in his hands. But he did not make known to his father or mother what he had done. So this is no ordinary strength. This is a strength which can tear apart lions with his bare hands. So imagine him in human-to-human confrontation. There would have been no human that could do anything to him or injure or inflict him with harm in any way, unless, of course, his great strength, which is the secret of which is going to be unlocked by another Philistine. This one we know by name, Delilah. That's in the 16th chapter. And it came, and in between we read of a riddle that he gives to the denizens of his Philistine would-be bride's town, a riddle. And it came to be on the 7th day that they said to Samson's wife, entice your husband to explain the riddle to us, or else we burn you in your father's house with fire. Have you invited us in order to take what is ours? Is it not. So they're using threat of arson. They're going to light their father's house on fire and everyone in it unless she can extract from her husband the meaning of this riddle, which the terms and outlines are explained after and in between. And Samson's wife wept before him and said, "You only hate me and do not love me. You have put forth a riddle to the sons of my people, but you have not explained it to me." And he said to her, "Look, I have not explained it to my father or mother, and should I explain it to you?" So she's using the levers of his heart to suggest that he does not love her as he claims, but hates her, because if he loved her, he would divulge this information to her. But he tells her that don't take it personally. I haven't even told it to my father and mother, so why should I explain it to you? And she had wept before him the 7 days while the feast lasted, and it came to be on the 7th day that he informed her, because she pressed him so much. She then explained the riddle to the sons of her people. Now this reminds us of the parable in Luke's 18th chapter, the unrighteous judge who is so pestered by this woman's perpetual petitioning that eventually he relents and gives in, not because he was just or oriented towards administering justice. He was an unrighteous judge, but because the pestering got too much, and that we can imagine something similar happened with Samson. Rather than hear this woman nag for another day, he eventually relented and gave in. And they figure out the riddle, and then in the 18th verse and then the 19th verse we read, "Then the Spirit of Yahweh came upon him mightily, and he went down to Ashkeloth and smote 30 of their men, stripped them, and gave the changes of garments to those who had explained the riddle. And his displeasure burned, and he went back up to his father's house." So he sent the ones who had figured out the riddle by devious means a message by smiting or killing 30 Philistines and giving their garments to those who had figured it out by lulling his wife to lure out the answer from him. And he was angry at this moment in time. He was motivated by vengeance, and he went up to his father's house, and we read that the woman he intended to marry was given to his best man. And his father says that, "I thought you hated her intensely," so he gave her to her. And then in the 14th verse of the 15th chapter we read, "When he came to Lehi, the Philistines came shouting to meet him, and the Spirit of Yahweh came mightily upon him, and the ropes that were on his arm became like flax that is burned with fire, and his bonds broke loose from his hands." So the Spirit visited him mightily, we read once more, and that would have endowed him with his superior strength, and so he was bound up at this moment in time, ropes around his arm. They burned as if a fire had been lit under them, so his human strength was sufficient to tear lions apart with his bare hands. He could certainly untrap himself from their ropes. "And he found a fresh jawbone of a donkey, and put out his hand and took it, and smote 1,000 men with it." So a jawbone was not an ordinary military weapon, but in the hands of one as strong as was he, it was an effective instrument of war, and he smote no less than 1,000 men with him, and this would have been all at once. Now, Samson was not a team player. He did not organize or challenge the Israelites to liberate the oppressors, but he seemed content to fight all his battles alone. He was a selfish man. He was prone to his lust. He did not take his calling seriously, and he treated trivially that which should have been treated significantly, the Nazirite vow, and it gets him into a whole water of trouble, as we'll soon read. "And Samson said, With the jawbone of a donkey, 1 heap, 2 heaps. With the jawbone of a donkey, I have smitten 1,000 men." So we understand that he was a man prone to bragging. He was proud of his great strength and what he had done and could do through it. And then in the 18th verse we read, "And he became very thirsty, and cried out to Yahweh, and said, You have given this great deliverance by the hand of your servant, and now am I to die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised?" So because he had liberated and delivered Yahweh's chosen people from the hands of the Philistines. What good was it for him to die at this moment in time and be at the mercy of the circumcised? Now, without water, he could not physically function or sustain himself. And Elohim split the hollow place that is in Lehi, and water came out, and he drank, and his spirit came back, and he revived. So he called its name El Hakor, which is in Lehi to this day. So at this location, Yahweh performed a miracle on his behalf, whereby he made water, drinkable water, fresh water available to him, and this restored his spirit and his strength, and he revived. And he ruled Israel 20 years in the days of the Philistines. So his judgeship or rulership, the judges were the rulers for all intents and purposes during this period of time, lasted 20 years. They had been oppressed by the Philistines for 40 years. But it's not over from there, as we read in the 16th and final chapter of his story, that he gets himself in trouble with the Philistines, and it all starts with his lust for another Philistine woman by the name of Delilah. And in the 4th verse of the 16th chapter it reads, "And it came to be afterward that he loved a woman in the river Sorek, whose name was Delilah. And the princes of the Philistines came up to her and said to her, Entice him, and find out where his great strength lies, and see by what we might overpower him. Then we shall bind him to humble him. And let us give you, each one of us, 1,100 pieces of silver." So they used the same strategy. They knew his weakness for their woman. They had an access point through which they could manipulate him through the woman whose ear he had listened to. He could tell them his secrets. He could tell them the meaning of his riddle. He could tell her the meaning of the secret source of his great strength. And through that, they were going to offer her 1,100 pieces of silver. Now, the 30 pieces of silver that Judas accepted to betray the master and ultimately threw back at the feet before killing himself would have been the price of a slave in an ancient world. So this is no small sum of change. The Philistines meant business. They wanted this man gone because he had expelled them from their domination of his people. And Delilah said to Samson, Please reveal to me where your great strength lies, and by what you might be bound, to humble you. So right there, he should have, his radar should have been beeping with intensity and frequency, but he was so blinded by love. The dialogue between the passage we're going to cover next consists of him telling her lies and half-truths as to this source. But anyone except Samson could see that he was being played for a fool, but he was so blinded by lust and love that he could not see it himself. And then in the 15th verse we read, Then she said to him, How do you say I love you when your heart is not with me? You have mocked me these 3 times, and have not made known to me where your great strength lies. So through a series of 3 lies, she follows them as if they were actual secrets, and even though he survives and emerges triumphant even after all these traps which involve the Philistines, but she's using the same ploy to his heart that the unnamed Philistine used earlier. He's accusing him of lack of love to her and hatred, and heart is not with me would have been not a husbandly disposition to have towards a wife. And it came to be when she pressed him daily with her words and urged him so that his being was wearied to death. So she pursues the same strategy that her unnamed Philistine female predecessor used of nagging him and dragging him down until eventually and inevitably he relents. Now, there was no reason for him to do so except he just didn't want to be bothered. That he made known to her all his heart, and said to her, No razor have ever come upon my head, for I have been a Nazarene to Elohim from my mother's womb. If I were shaven, then my strength would leave me, and I would become as weak as any other man. So we earlier read that he scooped out honey from the lion whom he had killed through the strength of the Spirit, and that would have been a violation of the Nazirite vow. They were not to come into contact with any dead or unclean thing, so he did not take seriously the vow, which was the source of his strength until this time. And as we read, Delilah makes the most of that information, and she uses it to tell her people to ultimately bind him up and humble him and make him as weak as any other man. And Delilah saw that he had made known to her all his heart, and she sent and called for the princes of the Philistines, saying, Come up once more, for he has made known to me all his heart. So the princes of the Philistine came up and brought the silver in their hands. Now these three previous times, the three previous parties of the Philistines would have been deceived through faulty information. He told her a series of lies which did not diminish his strength in any way, but here she's convinced of the truth, and they bring the silver in her hand to accept the payment. And then in the we read that they acted out this instructions. They made the most out of these instructions she had provided and placed him in a temple to Dagon, their mighty one, their god, and there proceeded to humiliate him. So the Philistines did not want to kill Samson. It was more strategically effective to humiliate him and keep him captured as a signs to all the nations around them that they would no longer be menaced by this menacing individual, and they wanted to utilize his strength to their advantage. And it came to be, when their hearts were glad, they said, Call for Samson, and let him entertain us. So they called for Samson from the prison, and he entertained them. And they made him stand between the columns. So at this moment in time, he would have been blinded. His eyes would have been gouged out, and he would have been in shackles and at the mercy of what used to be no physical obstacle at all to him, but had since become them. And Samson said to the young man who held him by the hand, Let me alone, and let me feel the columns which support the house, so that I lean on them. And the house was filled with men and women, and all the princes of the Philistines were there, and about 3,000 men and women were on the roof, who watched Samson entertaining. So this was a grand gathering of Philistines who had gathered collectively to see the great Israelite champion humiliated in their midst, and this would have been a species of entertainment for them. But little do they know that while his hair is growing back, so too his great strength comes back with him, and to place him at that strategic location in the temple would have been vital for what he has in mind, what he's planning to do. And Samson called to Yahweh, saying, O Master Yahweh, remember me, I pray. Strengthen me, I pray only this time, O Elohim, and let me avenge myself on the Philistines with vengeance for my 2 eyes. So he was not a godly man. His prayer was rooted in vengeance. He was angry at them because they had took out his 2 eyes. So he's asking to allow him to kill himself and everyone in the room with him at this moment. That's the substance of his prayer, and he's praying with abandon, and he knows his time is short, but he's willing to do whatever it takes to let them not get away with what they thought they were getting away with. And Samson took hold of the 2 middle columns which supported the house, and he braced himself against them, one on his right and the other on his left. And Samson said, Let me die with the Philistines. And he bowed himself mightily, and the house fell on the princes of all the people in it. And the dead that he had killed at his death were more than he had killed in his life. So at this moment in time, all the years slaying and smiting the Philistines, he had just collectively killed more in his final act of life than he did in all the moments preceding it. There were 3,000 on the roof, and the great princes, the great aristocrats, the great powers among them were underneath the roof, and they would have all died along with him in the collapse, which only his physical strength could do. And his brothers and all his father's household came down and took him and brought him up and buried him between Zor and Eshtaol in the tomb of his father Manoah, and he had ruled Israel 20 years. So this is the capstone of his 20-year judgeship. It ultimately ends in the deadly defeat of the Philistines, and so deadly was it that it also killed him. But he did come perform what he had came to do. He did not make the most of the promise, but he did fulfill the promise. He is a lesson in squandered potential. He was a selfish man who who took trivially the covenant and his vows to God, and because he did that, he ultimately squandered much of his potential, and so he survives as a lesson that strength apart from submission to the Spirit is not a good long-term investment. So that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. Bye-bye.